Welcome to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast, where we cut through the noise and help you make sense of the chaotic information space around us. I'm Griff Somke. Bad faith mass attacks, modeled on the success of Gamergate, are happening more and more often to journalists and activists online. In this episode, sociologist Karl Folk and I break down some of the inauthentic methods that the American right-wing outrage machine uses to target its enemies, and suggest some solutions to prevent them from being able to manipulate the media into helping. Stick around.
This is a crusade. This is a holy war against the deep state.
Where are the dictators? Where are the strong men?
Donald Trump is our instrument for retribution.
I'm going to fight for Christians. I'm going to fight for white people.
They have the Great Reset. We have the Great Awakening.
And why shouldn't I root for Russia? Because I am.
I want to see these people go through misery because of their grooming against our children.
After the assailant entered the home asking, "Where's Nancy? Where's Nancy?" Those are the very same words used by the mob when they stormed the United States Capitol.
I did nothing wrong.
Karl, how are you?
Good. All things considered, good.
Indeed. Yeah, it's better than it could be.
Yes.
It's kind of a depressing situation we find ourselves in right now. And I got to say, one of the more depressing aspects of this job is watching the same thing happen over and over again, watching the same tricks convince the same people to make the same dumb mistakes again and again and again. It'll really, really bum you out, man.
It's maddening, like just seeing the exact same minutia and tactics time after time and seeing them work.
Yeah. And there's this concept. It's called reflexive control.
Yes.
And the Handbook of Russian Information Warfare by the NATO Defense Institute describes it as follows. Control of an opponent's decision is achieved by means of providing him with the grounds by which he is able to logically derive his own decision, but one that is predetermined by the other side. Now, pardon the gendered language here, but that's a pretty good summary of the concept. It's basically feeding an opponent information that plays on their preconceived ideas of a situation to get them to make the choice that you want them to make, and making them think it was their choice.
Yes.
So if you know that your opponent is going to react a certain way to certain information, one could even say reflexively, you can control the information in front of them, and you can be assured that you will get the reaction. Hence, reflexive control.
Yep.
It's pretty slick stuff, and it's not too terribly different than advertising, which of course we all know doesn't work. By the way, you should make sure to like and subscribe to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast on whatever platform you're listening on, and please leave your 5-star review. Some advertisements are more successful than others. Hopefully that one does well. Anyway, one of the more successful examples of reflexive control in the last decade or so has been what we kind of informally refer to as the right-wing outrage machine. We've discussed Gamergate on this program quite a bit, and that's because it's really been the most successful example of how a very small number of people online can use words and phrases that they know will get the response they want. And one of the features of social media is that it's beyond easy to spin up the appearance of a large groundswell of public opinion in support of whatever you're trying to accomplish. Remember Me Too?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so this is something we saw them leverage quite effectively. You probably remember Me Too. It was a social media-based campaign to put a spotlight on the prevalence of sexual assault in society. And one of the results of Me Too was that a lot of people who were tagged and dragged ended up getting fired from their jobs or quote-unquote canceled in some way, usually very quickly, without a whole lot of reflection. And the outrage machine noticed this. And as it does, it figured out a way to use this reflexive reaction. And in one particular case, they used some extremely dubious allegations of sexual assault to get a lot of people who really should have known better to demand and receive the resignation of Senator Al Franken from the great state of Minnesota.
Yes.
And looking back now, it's very obvious we got played, but it worked.
Oh, yeah. And it works not every time, but they have gotten a system down where if they can whittle down certain attributes that are sound clippable and memeable, and the volume goes from a relatively normal volume to so loud that it's almost impossible to do anything. And I've been really watching lately, that dynamic is back tenfold in certain areas. And it's focused in a new way.
Oh, yeah. It's become the go-to tactic when they want to get rid of someone because it works.
Yep.
And the best part for them is that it's asymmetrical. It literally only works against outlets that value truth and ethical behavior.
Exactly.
Because if you don't really care about what the partisans on your side are doing or whether they're truthful and ethical, then you are immune to this particular attack vector.
Well, exactly.
Yeah, just imagine any outlet that employs Jack Posobiec or Laura Loomer being convinced to let them go because of bad behavior. Or imagine anyone at Fox News deciding not to platform Haya Rychik anymore because she's a stochastic terrorist whose minions make death threats to her victims.
Exactly.
Maybe we shouldn't put her on the air anymore because, we're tired of children's hospitals getting bomb threats.
Yeah, it's a completely asymmetrical thing. And this is always the issue with the, authoritarianism, far-right authoritarianism versus truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because at the end of the day, it's not a competing political view necessarily entirely.
Mm-hmm.
It's also it's a competing vision of reality, right?
Absolutely.
And so when you have that as the dynamic, we run into really immediate problems that ripple out in really unique ways.
They do. And when you're prepared to refer to the other side as unhumans, and you're successful with this, you can cause someone to lose a job, platform, any number of other consequences. And you can use it in all the bad faith you like, because for some reason that they never seem to figure in, you can say that your goal is to get someone fired by any means necessary. And no one ever seems to take that into account when they're considering whether or not to let you go because of some gotcha they found on your timeline or in some YouTube video that got made years ago. They don't seem to even care that, hey, here's this adversary. And when you're referring to me as an unhuman in your book, you're damn sure an adversary. Whether you want to play it that way or not, that's fine.
100%, right? Like when I've been on the show before and when I've written about it, like I talk about constellations of actions and outcomes with far-right groups or individuals or ideologies. And really this is that in its most kind of physical and visceral form, right? Like you can't look at one postage stamp sized picture of what's going on in any of these situations. Say you have someone getting trolled online for putting up an image they weren't supposed to, or putting up a tweet they weren't supposed to, or putting out video they weren't supposed to.
I mean, last week, Laura Loomer posts what she says is gotcha audio of Senator Sherrod Brown saying the N-word with a hard R.
Yep.
And she's all about that. Turns out that was a quote from GOP strategist Lee Atwater explaining the Southern strategy and how to dog whistle.
Correct.
That whole thing is how to dog whistle. And it's like, wow, Laura, you got some cheek coming out there and saying this is a thing when your whole timeline is a dog whistle. Pretty amazing.
Well, and that's just it, right? It's an amazing form of like inversion, right? Mm-hmm. And this inversion is the heart of the far right's machine to dismantle truth, right? And like these are all attacks on truth, ultimately.
Yeah.
People talk about the attacks on journalism or on the free press or on those things. What they're talking about is that attack on truth.
Yeah.
And what you see repeatedly is far right and fascist and new right, whatever varieties really leaning in right now to this understanding that like words are very pliable in people's hands if the people are willing to completely disregard any kind of good faith, reason, or truth. And that is something that is not new by any means within these circles.
No, definitely.
But the fact that media seems to be much more pliable to things like a Laura Loomer level misinformation post, is deeply problematic, right? Like this is an information problem as much as a fascism, far right radicalization problem.
Right. And it's like there is a group out there that has learned if they play certain phrases, if they say certain words, they can cause certain reactions on the part of, for lack of a better phrase here, legacy media. They can get people who aren't paying a whole lot of attention to their bullshit to look at a situation and say, this person has, 1 million followers, and there's a whole bunch of accounts responding to them and repeating these claims. But when you drill into it, you realize that most of these accounts have a whole bunch of numbers at the end of their name.
Yep.
And they exist pretty much to get upset about this. That's, to me, the definition of inauthentic.
Correct. And I mean, realistically, like, no one will ever be able to say one way or the other what's arbitrarily true in this situation, in the sense of who's real and who's not real posting, right? Because especially on Twitter right now, or excuse me, X.
No, you don't have to use that. You can use its real name. It's fine.
Yeah, I will. So on Twitter, at one point we could look at the API and understand better what was actually happening kind of under the surface, both trend-wise and just more broad understanding of the conversation, at large. And now we have no understanding of that, but it's clear what we can see, just through using the app or the website. This seems to be the direction all of it's going.
Yeah.
As they lose some of their foothold in a public-facing political manner, right? Both here and in Britain, we've seen this. And we've also seen kind of an explosion of really interesting, let's say, behavior in circles that are not purely right-wing circles by any means.
Right.
So it's starting to move around a little bit. There's a lot of this outrage machine that has shifted to other areas because it's more lucrative for their dopamine hits or whatever they're getting out of this.
Yeah. And when these things happen, the temptation is really to go all in on the narrative and the amygdala hits, which does feel good. But we as a society need to learn how to take a step back and a big, deep breath, all of us, and consider whether or not we're getting played. Because we really spend a lot of time having inauthentic narratives fed to us in a lot of these cases.
Well, and that's just it, right? Like, the thing that I think a lot of people don't fully understand or grasp about the far right outside of its political machine is it's a narrative machine. More than anything, the far right builds and tries to stick narratives to things so it can then remove them and dissect them piece by piece, because that's what has to happen for them to be successful.
Yeah.
And we've seen the inverse of that now, right? Like the right has failed at labeling the Harris Walls campaign effectively, and we can see what that looks like when it failed. So it's really important, like, that we decontaminate our other information systems, right? Like the press and corporate media specifically needs a deep and thorough cleaning.
They need to understand, and this is, where it's valuable for some of these outlets to pick up people who kind of live in that world a little more. They need to understand the tactics in the playing field. They need to have people on staff that can point to, a story and say, hey, that's High Chick and her network spinning this up. You don't need to cover it to the extent that you do.
Right.
Or you don't need to cover it a certain way because this is what they're up to. They need that counterpoint, and they need that person on staff who can look at these stories and point to it and say, nah.
Well, and at the end of the day, like, truth doesn't have a side, right?
Right.
Like, there is just truth. And those things don't play to everyone's, what they want and what they believe.
Yeah.
And that's just how it is. So, one of the things that media could immediately do is literally just say certain things are lies, right? It literally, that alone would really neuter some of the ability for people to say, well, because you don't allow me to speak my hate speech, let's say.
Yeah.
That's the equivalent of the government censoring me. This is the wishy-washy logic of the far right, though.
Yes.
And it shows how those things work then to buttress and reinforce this understanding of the world that we need to, as the majority of the population and a population that has a dedication to democracy, we have to step up then and say, no, these are lies.
Yeah.
And we're not going to value lies at the same level we value truth. And that is an incredibly hard thing, I think, to conceptualize, but it isn't as hard to enact as I think we would be led to believe, because it really just does start saying, no, that's not true.
And I don't think this is something that you need to pass a whole lot of laws to deal with.
No, not at all.
I think this is something that the media outlets have to take a certain level of responsibility for. The people who cover these kinds of controversies. I mean, even if it's just like having an ombudsman on staff that can look at these things and say, let's look a little beyond the specific words that are being used here. Let's look at how this whole thing came together. You know, put somebody in who knows how to go to 4chan or whatever and see where this got spun up in the first place.
Exactly. And that's, I had said something on Twitter that basically was saying very similar to that, right? Which is that I think newsrooms would be really advantaged by not just hiring people who are counter disinformation or counter misinformation,
right?
But people who actually understand the dynamics of the far right and how they function as a information body, not as a political body, but how they transmit their ideas, how they reinforce and create narratives, all of that, because that's really, you don't have to put that in the news, but you do need to understand that to report the news correctly.
Yeah.
And that's the big thing. This isn't something where we're going to write new laws to get ourselves out of it. It's a responsibility thing of people in positions of almost institutional power, right?
Right. And that's something that we've always tried to do with this program, is not just point out, oh, this is true and this isn't. It's more of a case of like, these are the people pushing the idea. This is how the sausage gets made on their end. This is what this campaign looks like. And you can judge for yourself then how much credence you want to give something. Like, I've always felt to some extent that most consumer products should come with a label that tells you how much the worker who made it got paid.
Yes, exactly.
And that way you could make your own decisions about whether you feel good about purchasing this or something else based on information like that. This isn't to say you can't do it. I mean, if you're Nike and you want to pay the kid some ridiculously small amount of money in Bangladesh to make your shoes, that's fine, but I want to know about that.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, it's a moral transparency, right? That really enforces a level of critical thought that most people don't do and most people aren't forced to do. And that's the kind of critical thinking, though, that we need to apply to the way that we report and deal with these groups.
Yeah.
Because we do ourselves a disservice, and we do our form of government as a democracy a disservice by not having a conversation that can fully encompass what it actually is. Because it's not one sentence. It's not one statement. It's not one thing. It's a constellation of events, statements, intent, and goals, right? And stated goals. And that's a much harder picture sometimes to interpret and understand correctly.
Right.
In the speed that these groups and actors move, right?
Right. They move fast. They move fast now. They can have a media campaign going within minutes in some cases of finding information. And that old story about a lie travels halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. It's like, yeah. And it's even worse now.
Oh, yeah, no, we're in such a different world for how fast information, and especially bad information, travels. It's just shocking. And you couple that with AI and whatever else, and you literally have the ability to create narratives, create stories, create really appealing things to people out of whole cloth in 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah. And this is why I think I'm coming to the conclusion that fighting any individual piece of news that turns out to be a complete lie is almost pointless, because it's just, you can't do it. But what you got to do is have people on staff at these outlets who understand how this stuff gets put together.
Yep.
And at that point, you trust them. You listen to their word on these things and say, this is what an inauthentic outrage campaign looks like. And this is where it came from. And these are the people who started it.
and just being able to point out too, like even to, at like an editorial level, because they're the ones fielding, any kind of feedback, whether it's real or fake. It's hard to discern what's what, right? Like if you're not able to understand that, that's hard. So if you have someone who can tell them, well, let's look at these things. And if you see some key indicators, accounts that are focused solely on one thing, focused on decontextualizing whole arguments, whatever it is, you can start to get a better picture of whether this is an authentic thing or if this is something that is totally, kind of snowballing from some small grain that was seized on.
And if you look at that account and you say, this guy's really upset about this, and then, you go back on the timeline, you look and you see, this account was established 2 years ago. And you look back 2 years ago to see what they were talking about, and they're mad at the same journalist over something completely different. And you look at their posts and it turns out, wow, they're just pissed at this journalist. Everything this person does, they're mad about. Maybe we should factor that into our calculations of how we deal with this story.
Right.
Maybe we don't necessarily take this person, if that's what it is, as seriously as, say, somebody who's maybe focused on other things once in a while too and willing to put their name on it.
Right. And when you see that it's not just a single account, like there are cases where you'll find like a network of accounts that are singularly focused on one person.
Oh yeah.
Or one group of people. And that, that's become increasingly common to kind of find these smaller blobs of really extremely narrowly focused troll accounts. And that, though, is part of a broader picture as well, right? So you have to understand, too, like as someone in that position, you have to be able to suss all of this out in probably a 30-minute time span, potentially.
Yeah.
And I think it says something about where we are, that the media itself seems to be unable to, or unwilling, whichever it is, to really understand that there is going to have to be a systemic approach to these issues. It can't be individuals and individual actions snapped out and avoided.
Right. It's not getting better. It's getting worse.
Yes.
And that is why it becomes so important to understand not just the tactic, but the network that's behind the tactic, because that way you can get ahead of it. You can say, we're not picking that up because it comes from, this particular outlet that's known for this particular level of behavior. No, we're not doing that.
Right. That turns into almost muscle memory at some point, right? Where you have like a list, almost a blacklist of accounts or sources that just are going to either be a problem in the way that they put things out or the way that they try and manipulate internally and really couch the refs, right?
Right.
It's the classic kind of conservative move of trying to really mess with the refs versus deal with the actual thing.
Yeah.
And what we can, we as a population should be invested in making sure those refs can't be screwed with.
Right.
And I think that's increasingly, especially if the far right loses political power, is going to especially be something we have to focus on.
Right.
Because it's going to only get more out of control.
It will. And I think you're going to get the inevitable claims on their part of screaming, censorship and, help, I'm being repressed and all of that. But at some point, if you tell enough lies, if enough of the things that you come up with turn out to be bullshit, then I'm not sure why anyone has any responsibility to keep platforming you at that point. It's not about censorship. It's about, we can't keep lying to our audience.
That's just it, right? Like at a certain point, platforming lies isn't doing anything but undermining the credibility of everything, right? And that's the goal ultimately for some of this, but like with the media itself, you either make money or you don't.
Exactly.
And ultimately this is a money game for corporate media, and lies at a certain point become a financial problem. Ask Fox News.
Yeah. At some point you can get too far over your skis and you end up losing billions as a result of it. And you hate to see it, but at the same time, you love to see it because it means there is a limit.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to do this indefinitely, make up things, let your highly rated TV host go ahead and say these things every night for a year or so and not have to, deal with the consequences of it.
We're starting to see some things with that, right? Like I think about what's happened since the far right uprising in Britain.
Right.
And like stuff's starting to happen where people are starting to maybe realize it's not censorship to be told if you stoke a riot, that's a crime.
Mm-hmm.
It's simple stuff. And I think what's interesting to me is it feels revolutionary that people are starting to have minimal restrictions placed on truly incredibly vile speech.
Yeah. And they start digging down a little bit and telling you who the people are that are causing some of this. It's like, you look at Stephen Yaxley Lennon, who's the guy who started a lot of this shit in England. He likes to call himself Tommy Robinson because supposedly he was a soccer hard man or something in his day. I was trying to figure it out. I was like, why do they call him Tommy Robinson? Why don't they just call him the hyphenated name? That sounds so much better. But
I'm sure someone on Twitter will tell us.
Right. And so he's this multi-time convicted felon vacationing in Cyprus when all this is going on. Yet he has
vacationing.
Yeah, he's vacationing in Cyprus and he's got his phone and he's starting all these riots. And it's like, you're on vacation because you're going to go to jail. You stick around for this. And doesn't seem to matter. These people have convinced themselves that like he's the voice of the forgotten man in England and it's time to take our country back and we're firing up the English Defense League again and all of this.
Oh my God. It's so out of control.
Yeah.
It's such a clear, just like delineation of the mindset for this type of reactionary and fascist, where it's just like they believe the things they're saying, right? Like they believe that the world's against them. They believe that there's a global conspiracy against white people. They believe that, all of this stuff, and like it's all just shades of the same conspiracy theories we've heard for forever.
Well, I mean, it's white genocide. It's the, the farmers in South Africa stuff. It's all like part of the same narrative that multiple different, supposedly unconnected actors push all the time.
Yeah.
And if you can get somebody to buy part of it, then it's a whole lot easier to sell them the rest of what you're selling.
Well, and that's just it, right? And we're starting to see that in the more concerning ways as it kind of expands into circles of the online left and different contingents. And it's just starting to spread. And it's, ultimately a lot of this mimics some of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that have floated around forever in these same groups. They mimic the deeply fascist, like white replacement stuff that came out of both, some of the more militant forms of like the Aryan nation thinking and that. Yeah.
And you're starting to see rhetoric coming out of some of these leftist spaces that absolutely mimics and outright borrows big, huge chunks of the 1970s and 1980s white supremacist movement. And you're seeing people like, Max Blumenthal and Aaron Mate using these things supposedly as a joke.
Right.
But they're using it in context. They're not joking about it. They're using it in the same way the Nazis do.
I was going to say, it's the exact same thing that in 1996, 1997, you would have run into when you're like, why are you pushing, the Turner Diaries?
It is.
And someone says, I'm just kidding, bro.
Yeah. It's like, what's the joke? I don't get it. Maybe I'm like old and lame and out of touch. That's fine. I can accept that. Tell me what joke I'm missing here. If this is funny, I don't get it.
Yeah. And that's what I mean. That's what I would have asked Mate and Blumenthal when they went off on their thing earlier this week, right? Like this is a thing that is getting out of control quickly because it can take the form of different groups, right? Like the groups it's involved with, it's going to start to kind of mimic. And ultimately the same thinking that goes into like online trolling and online Gamergate style attack is the same thinking that goes into this.
And at some point, the goal is to create this nihilistic mob.
Yeah.
That is easy to maneuver and to point at things and say, go be outraged about this. And then it turns into the full-on harassment campaign as a result.
Well, and for the people involved, it demotivates them from doing things that might actually, like if they're in a left circle, right? It might work to demotivate people from actually going out and affecting change that is positive and continues to put the far right in a backwards facing position.
Yeah.
And, that's the thing that people really, I think, need to realize overall. This isn't about pushing you anywhere. It's not telling you to become far right. It's not telling you to become a liberal. It's not telling you to become a communist. It's trying to just tell you to give up and to stop caring.
Right.
And to care about the outrage over the actions and the repercussions and the people you're being pointed. I mean, it's very much a big machinery now.
Yeah.
To get people away from just the idea of democracy as a functional entity.
Mm-hmm. Because the other side is not going to stop.
No.
The other side has a plan. And, the book that J.D. Vance, Trump's running mate, wrote a blurb for kind of lays it out. Jack Posobiec wrote a book called Unhumans. And like I said, for my sins, I've read it. And he spends a whole lot of time trying to tell you what a great guy Francisco Franco, the former dictator of Spain, was.
Exactly. And Claremont Institute's mainlining Franco right now for the same reason, right? Like they are going in one direction and they are going to follow that in all of the things they do.
And this is what they want.
Yes.
And if you look at the legacy of Franco in Spain, you can't glorify this guy anymore. It's treated like Holocaust denial in Germany. They had a truth commission.
Yeah, truth and reconciliation was a thing there because this was, as someone who has studied fascism a long time and has read a lot, I would argue that Franco is the true expression of what Hitler wanted and what Mussolini believed to be true about fascism.
Yeah.
And Franco, there's not enough talked about publicly, in my opinion, about what Franco actually did with specific light on the way that he used the church as a weapon to get to his points where he could then use them as the tool of a broader agenda that was genocidal and a true expression of fascism.
And he wanted his version of Spain, his Castilian version, to be the only thing anybody did.
Yes.
He came down on, the Basques. He came down on the Catalans. He came down on all the various ethnic groups in the country. He came down on the Jews. He came down on the gay people. He had an agenda, and it involved making Spain look like he wanted it to look.
Yes, exactly. His singular vision, right? Like a true dictatorship of a singular dictatorship. And it's interesting, just there are some striking parallels in a number of ways that the far right here has adopted his ideology, but also some of the more integral players within the Nazi government that kind of look similar, right? Like the Carl Schmitz and different people. And this is right in that playbook. Everything we've talked about today is right in the playbook of both of those places.
And I think that that's an instructive thing for people. It's like, you want to find out what they're up to. It isn't necessarily studying Hitler. It's studying Franco. Go look at Franco. You'll understand it a lot better at that point.
Yeah, Franco is going to make things, illuminate things, right?
Yeah.
Like, don't go read Franco. Read about Franco.
Yeah.
But like,
don't read Siege, read about Siege.
Yes, correct. It's one of those things, though, like it is really illuminating because you do start to see really striking parallels, both in how they understand the state's power, but also the way to deconstruct the state's power and reorient it towards a singular vision.
And they've made no secret of the fact that that's their goal at this point, is to seize the power of the state and reorient it in the direction they want to. This is the point of Project 2025. This is the point of Trump Force 47.
Yeah, Agenda 47. Yeah.
Exactly. They want to do this, and they're making no bones about it. So if you are a believer in liberal democracy, or if you believe in anything other than what they believe in, you probably better take a hard look at this and say, is this really something we want to enable on any level?
Right.
Because it's coming for you.
Exactly. And I would just reiterate, I think, on that note, like the media itself, no matter how cozy you are with the founders, funders, and faces of the movement, you're not going to, they won't be spared either, because the reorientation is a total reorientation.
Right.
Not a pseudo-democratic shell, but a total reorientation.
Mm-hmm. They want to focus society on that vision. And they're making it very clear that this is what they're going to do if you give them the power. And part of giving them the power isn't necessarily just who you vote for. It's media outlets giving them the power as well.
That's exactly right.
Giving them the power to dictate outrage, giving them the power to dictate the narrative that gets pushed, letting these people sort of jerk them around.
Yep.
Gets them that level of power that they're looking for.
Yeah.
So really, at some point, they've got to start putting people in positions of oversight that understand the tactics and understand what's being done here.
Well, it's one of those things, like, there are very few real binaries in the world, but like with democracy, you have to have a functioning journalism body to work with it and to protect it and to work through it, to also weed out bad actors, right? And if we want democracy, we have to want and really require a journalism field and a corporate media structure that doesn't reinforce the bad actors' view,
right,
but reinforces the people speaking from the place of truth and honesty, and forcing the bad actor to refute that.
Yeah, because they don't want to have that conversation. That is not a conversation they want to have at all. If you can get them on the back foot trying to explain that, you've won the argument. It's over.
Yeah, well, and it's over, right? Like, we've seen it time and time again now in the last month.
Mm-hmm.
If they cannot control the narrative and push the bullshit, they can and will not be able to keep up with the real force of a conversation.
Mm-hmm. They crumble.
Yeah.
They crumple. And it's this last month, for anyone who's paying attention to this stuff, for anyone who's listening and thinking, why have we been doing it the other way for so many years? Well, that's a them question.
Yeah, that's a them question for sure.
You got to go ask them that question. You got to go ask the media sources that you consume, hey, all it took was 1 month worth of pushback on these guys and they fell apart.
Literally.
Why did no one actually do that before?
Well, and it's something I've been talking to people kind of around this, and it's literally been somewhat of that conversation. Just how the hell it's been 4 extra years of bullshit, and you're telling us it didn't take anything, it took very minimal pushback to completely break this force field of bullshit that they've been spewing? Come on.
Come tell me when you get the answer, because I'm not sure what the answer is. Come tell me why they didn't start pushing back sooner.
I think there are probably some answers that will come out that are illuminating.
Right.
It's instructive. Like you said, I think it's something where we just have to understand the way we deal with this going forward is not by not paying attention. It's by paying attention more, by pushing back harder, and really understanding that, like, truth is pretty darn easy to defend.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with people who can't even defend themselves from a joke about fucking a couch.
Thanks for listening to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast. If you want to hear more, you can find us on the web at didnothingwrongpod.com. Please make sure you subscribe to get our content straight into your inbox. You can also follow us on Twitter at GRZABJJ, GRZABJJ, as well as DNWPod. We're extremely grateful for paid subscriptions and donations that allow us to keep doing this important work. Thanks, and remember, everyone mentioned did nothing wrong.